You know what this movie was? This was the equivalent of that meme of copying someone's paper in class, but they tell you to change it up a bit to make it look like you didn't copy. Yeah, that's the one. Normally, I start these videos out by doing some sort of breakdown or history in the creation of this particular product that I'm talking about for the episode. Instead, I wanted to enlist the help of my good friend Christian. He is a longtime Death Note fan and feels very adamantly about this particular film that we're talking about today. But I'm not asking him to talk about the movie, I'm just asking him to give a brief rundown for you of what Death Note is from the original series.
It's time for the new segment. EPC is too lazy to do it himself, so he enlists the help of his friends to do it for him. Today's episode, KristjanKay.
Death Note was an important turning point in the American anime experience because it was one of the first times that we were exposed to a series that wasn't just about fighting or superpowers, but it was a subtle cat and mouse game between two great minds. It had deep philosophical questions about the moral choices that the characters would make, and drama that would keep us on the edge of our seats week to week, as opposed to the Netflix film that just used the concepts of the book and the names of the characters that they thought were cool, and didn't realize that, the Death Note isn't really what the series is about.
Talk about the original.
Okay.
The original.
Take Light Dog to me, okay? Light is one of the most complex characters in anime. He's the top of his class in his country. He's loved by his family and friends. Oh, and by the way, he's an actual sociopath who gets his hands on a magical notebook that can kill people. It's a compelling start to a story that's all about a compelling character. Unlike Light Turner, who is a sniveling little weasel baby who cries in the face of fear and is just a little smarter. They show us that he does homework for others for money, and that's supposed to tell us he's smart, but that's just breaking a rule in storytelling. Show us he's smart through action, not at the Easter egg explanation. They give us less than 10 seconds. We're supposed to feel bad for him when he gets beat up by a bully at the start. Compared to the original character from the manga and anime, Light Turner is a total pushover and is compelling in the slightest.
Please focus on the original, please, not the original.
All the characters and moments in Death Note are ones that are super memorable and have a lasting impact on the viewers. You can talk to someone about Death Note and you'll have things you can discuss. This is a story that anyone can witness because of how deep the level of storytelling can get, all while pushing boundaries of what is good and evil. And then you have the Netflix movie, something I can't share with anyone about because I choose not to remember anything about it, because this movie isn't worth remembering in the slightest, and I try to push it to the back of my brain, but it keeps coming back to haunt me. You do one podcast episode about a new release, and suddenly you notice a guy who talked about Death Note movie, and just keeps following. No matter how much the movie's better things, the movie is nothing. This movie doesn't understand anything about what the original series was. I would say it was all style, no substance, but doesn't have style. I don't think I could tell you anything that happened in this movie. Why was this made? Why is this possibly getting a sequel? Is this my fault for watching this trash pile? I don't want to think about this movie anymore.
Oh, wow, okay, that got a little heavier than I thought it was gonna get. My bad. With this description that we now have in mind, and for most of the people who are fairly adverse into the idea of what Death Note was about, being fans or casual viewers or readers of the original source material, you know that this particular Netflix interpretation wasn't very loved by fans. This particular episode is talking about how we can use the changes that the story was put under, mainly the idea of it being thrown into a different location and how we can use that to our advantage. It's time for our first emergency transplant episode. Let's begin. First and foremost, do not call this movie Death Note. I'm sorry, there really is no way of getting around that, and there really isn't any point in trying to beat around the bush about it either. Don't call this movie Death Note. That, in many different ways, has already been done, many times. Instead, if you're going to make an adaptation of something, well, why not make an interpretation of it? For example, since this film was so willing to use a completely different location, in this particular instance, Seattle, Washington, why not call this particular film Death Note Downpour? Yes, as a resident of the Seattle area, I am fully aware it doesn't actually rain here 24/7. Just roll with it, fellow Washingtonians. It's better than what that other series did for our state. No, get out! Get out! By calling it Death Note Downpour, it sets the ground of getting people to understand what exactly this film is from an immediate standpoint based on the title itself. It also does a job of getting people to understand that this is not the original story that they know, but contains elements from it. There are countless people who are fans of the original series who are going to understand that by this title alone, it's not the same story they're used to reading or seeing. It's an interpretation and takes inspiration from the original idea. Secondly, if you are going to change the characters, change them properly. Don't name one of the characters a similar or even the same name as the original source material, only to change their last name. That's not how naming a character works. This guy is not Light Yagami. Don't keep any part of that name into this new character. It's not fair to the original character, and it's especially not fair to the new character being created. Create an original character that stands on their own. Now, if you want to pay homage to the original character, that's fine. You are totally allowed to do that. Say they can have the same initials. Light Yagami meet Lucas Young. If you wanted to go even farther with that and base it off the phonetics of the Japanese words into the English dialect, sure, name him Ray Young. Wow, look at that. It's a ray of light. See? We can have tongue-in-cheek moments or clever moments when writing this, and that's okay. Just don't name the character the same as the original source material. It's not the same person. Don't treat them as such. And yes, that goes for all the characters in this screenplay. Stop making them half-baked versions of the original source. Stop doing that. You're setting yourself up for failure because they can't deliver the same impact as the originals did. So don't. The moment you set out to make an adaptation or a reimagining of the story, you need to go all out with reworking the stories and the characters within it. Otherwise, the similarities become uncanny and distracting because it's almost like the story itself doesn't know what it wants to be. This is one of those weird things that a lot of people think they're not allowed to do, and it's going to be said right here and right now. You, as a writer, a storyteller, whatever, you are allowed to change the original idea of something to suit the new story that you're making. It's been done time and time again and has worked brilliantly. How many times do you think Shakespeare's works have been reconfigured into something else that is just completely different from what you think, but keep elements from there? Without using Shakespeare, because that element has been done to death, here's some examples to better illustrate this. Did you know that the 1983 film Scarface was a remake? The first movie was in 1932 and was directed by Howard Hawks and Richard Rawson. Good movie in and of itself, but is cast into shadows by the 83 film by Oliver Stone, directed by Brian De Palma, starring Al Pacino. It was set in a completely different location, had a completely different set of characters, and was way more willing to take risks than the original film, which is why it's way more remembered than the original. Another example would be the 2002 Chinese film Internal Affairs, directed by Andrew Lau and Alan Mott. This story was between a mole in the police department and an undercover cop. Their objectives were the same: find out who's the mole, find out who's the cop. Compare this to the 2006 American film The Departed, which was about an undercover cop and the mole in the police department attempting to identify each other whilst infiltrating the Irish gang in South Boston. Notice how there are supreme similarities between the two of them, but they have key differences, most notably the location in which the stories take place, and yet they don't outshine each other. They're both fantastic films in and of themselves. How about a film that's supposed to be a remake that acknowledges the fact that it is a remake? Sure. How about True Grit? The original was a 1969 film by director Henry Hathaway, starring John Wayne and Kim Darby. A lot of people praise this film as a highlight for John Wayne, everyone's favorite cinema cowboy, or one of them anyway. But in 2010, True Grit was redone by the Coen brothers, starring Jeff Bridges and Haley Steinfeld. Not only does the remake take way more risks in terms of interpreting the Wild West, but it has way more developed levels in the acting department, as well as really capturing the grittiness of that time period, which makes the original 1969 film look like a parody by comparison. So, what am I getting at here? Well, the issue is that Netflix's Death Note film tried to be a hybrid between a remake and an adaptation. It wanted you to understand that a lot of the characters are supposed to be directly compared to the ones from the original source material, but also acknowledge that the events that take place in this story are supposed to be new iterations from the original. Here's the problem. There's no such thing as a hybrid between a remake and an adaptation because there are differences between the two of them. An adaptation, most often used in terms of storytelling for cinema, tends to to be a term used for when somebody takes an idea from any form of media that is not film and make it into a cinematic feature. If the story in question was from a book, a poem, television series, a video game series, it is an adaptation. A remake is someone taking an idea that is already made into a film, whether it be feature-length film or a short film, and redoing it with changes to the story that give it a different tone, mood, or theme. You also have to remember that you have to be clever about what you think is a remake. What about Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and compare that to Tim Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory film, the original Planet of the Apes film, and the 2001 film of the same name? A lot of people think those are remakes when they're not. They are adaptations, because both Chocolate Factory films are two versions of the book by Roald Dahl, as well as both Planet of the Apes films are different versions of the novel by Pierre Boulle. If you want to find more information about understanding the differences between remakes and adaptations, I recommend you check out Mr. Coates' video on what is a remake versus an adaptation. I'll have it linked in the description below. It's a great listen for anyone interested in story development of any kind. So with this knowledge in mind, we know that Netflix's Death Note film was an adaptation. It doesn't take any influence from the anime or live-action Death Note films in any way. The director, Adam Wingard, stated that the manga was the only source used for directing this film. If you're going to make an adaptation for something, and you're going to change radical amounts of information from the source material into what you're creating now, you need to make sure you actually go all out with it. Don't keep 50% of the original and invent 50% of a new idea and mash them together hoping it'll work. It comes off as incredibly lazy, and it doesn't help that you're taking ideas from a series that already has so many ideas already, that for you to not use some of the stuff that was invented in the original manga is infuriating. So let's go ahead and spitball some ideas based off of the stuff that we know, being someone who's actually from Seattle, the place that Death Note's Netflix interpretation actually takes place in. This location alone can give you some ideas that would have made the story stand out way more than the lackluster version we got. Anybody who knows anything about Death Note knows that the demon-like creatures that exist in this world are known as death gods, translated from Japanese pronounced originally as Shinigami. This makes sense, as the entire story pretty much takes place only in Japan. Realistically, mostly in Japan. I know that there are sometimes it kind of jumps all over the place, but the main focus is in Japan. However, in the very first issue of Death Note, they go all out of their way to let you know that there are many different types of death god that exist, and they take on different forms and physical attributes. One in particular that stands out both in the manga as well as the anime is a background character named Zulogi. This particular death god has visual ties to the Native American culture, particularly the Great Plain tribes, based on the war bonnet and leather hide that they wear. This concept that death gods can have influence on the culture opens the door to a particular source that we actually have in the Seattle area, being the Pacific Northwest coastal tribes in North American as well as Canadian coastline. The coastal cultural areas extend from California, through Oregon, through Washington's coast, through Canadian coastlines, reaching all the way up into Alaskan territories. There are many different tribes that exist throughout these areas, and many of their cultural influences would make their way into the story that we can create, including the historical and folklore inspirations from tribes such as the Chinook, Salish, Nooktas, Kwakatuals, Haida, Tsimshian tribes, and Tlingit tribes. A lot of traditional elements from the coastal Salish would work brilliantly into creating an original death god for this story that would fit the thematic sense as well as the aesthetic one. Now, before anybody starts getting all antsy with me about making original character do not steal, let's talk about how this works for the story's benefit. My main gripe that I had with Netflix's Death Note is the fact that they tried to use a lot of the cultural inspirations that came from the original manga, which in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but the problem is that it doesn't translate into being into a new location. According to the Netflix movie, which is weirdly explained in the way that it was presented, it makes it sound like death gods are only based in folklore from Japan. Thematically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would a Japanese death god be in Seattle? Let alone that the main character would find a book that explains Japanese death gods, and the one he finds in the book just happens to look like the one that he finds. It doesn't make any sense, and would make much more sense if the death god in question was actually tied to the location that they were actually found in. Some people would probably ask, well, why don't I use Zologi for this particular position? Honestly, you could try to have some way of making them fit into this position, but the problem is that based on the visual cues that were given, he doesn't exactly line up with this particular location. Like I stated before, with the war bonnet that he wears, he's more in line with the Great Plain tribes, like the Cheyenne, Pawnees, and Crow tribes. Not all Native Americans wear the same thing. Research first, comment later, think about it. Getting back into this new death god, we know from the Seattle area the people are known as the coastal Salish, those who surround the Puget Sound. They're known for their intricate woodworking skills, which can be found in their canoes, totem poles, and elaborate array of masks that are based off of their traditional folklore. Their clothing is also based off of cedar weaving, which is the process of taking cedar strips of bark, submerging them in water for a long period to make them more elastic, and then weaving them into intricate designs, which can be seen in the form of baskets, hats, and even clothing. With all of this in mind, we can imagine a creature wearing cedar clothing, from a woven shawl to a traditional headwear worn by the people of this region, covered in masks that are prominent in Salish culture. I went ahead and doodled this idea to better illustrate what I was thinking. An idea that kept popping up in my head was the visual idea of the happy mask salesman and the skull kid from The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, and think of a fusion between the both of them. You have a character in this design that not only manages to capture the sense of the culture in which it is located and based off of, but also fits the world established by what we already know about Death Note's lore. And that's the idea of this story, of Death Note Downpour. It's supposed to be an interpretation of what we know, and still abiding by the rules that were set place by the original, just with different locations, settings, characters, and understanding. So, with the changes that we've made, what kind of story can we create that matches this new setting and characters and ideas that still stay in the line and concept of the original Death Note? Well, to keep the importance of a character study in play like the original did, I can imagine that our protagonist, who we will refer to as Lucas, is a student currently enrolled in his first year of law school. On one of his bike rides from his apartment to the Seattle Public Library, he goes through Elliott Bay Park. He's taking in the scene of the sunset when suddenly his bike shakes from running over something. He stops and turns to see a book with a wooden cover in the middle of the pathway. He picks it up. On the front is carved into the actual cover. It seems to be a hand giving a round item to a bird-like creature, like a crow or a raven. Lucas opens the front cover to see that something is written on the inside, but it's a language he doesn't quite understand. In that moment, he hears a strange sound, like wooden wood chimes or wood blocks being tapped together. Lucas looks up to see someone walking up the bike path towards him. They wore a tall hat that looked to be made of something woven together. Its face was covered by a large mask resembling that of a bird. Its whole body was covered in masks of different colors and shapes, and that's what was making the sound. It was the masks hitting one another. It was walking towards Lucas, and for a moment, Lucas stood confused as to what he was looking at. Suddenly, a passing biker drew Lucas's attention away, but when he looked back, the masked person was gone. Without thinking, Lucas takes the book and pockets it and hops on his bike and continues on his way. He meets up with some friends from his law school where they have a study session for a couple of hours. Lucas remains after the library after they all leave. When he's alone, he takes out the book and opens it up to see that there are a series of names written on the inside. And upon doing so, he looks it up and finds out that all the names are connected to people who have died within the last 2 years. The names are in English, but what's written after the names is not. He asks the library assistant about the characters in the book, and they say that some of the characters line up with the written translation of Salatian language. Lucas begins to scan the rows and rows of books on Salish culture, finally finding an English dictionary that translates some of the key words that he was looking for. After skimming through it, he finds the words that are inside the cover that he couldn't read line up with something like Book of the Dead. Then Lucas hears it again, like wood chimes. He turns to see that the mask-wearing person from before now stands at the end of the book aisle. Lucas watches as this thing walks towards him, the sound of the masks hitting one of each other just filling the quiet room of the library. It stops right in front of him. The beak of the bird mask just inches away from Lucas's face. It stares down at the book in Lucas's hands, then looks at Lucas. It speaks in a language that Lucas doesn't understand. Lucas tries to tell the creature that he doesn't understand what they're saying. Then the creature's hand comes out from beneath the cedar shawl. Its hand looks like a shriveled up stick. Even the skin looked like bark that was flaking off. The hand taps on the cover of the book, and a finger flips it open to reveal the page with the names. Its finger traces one of the names, and then the creature stares at Lucas. After a moment, the finger taps on the name. Unsure exactly what to do, Lucas takes out his laptop and props it up on the bookshelf. He looks up the name that the hand was pointing to, finding an article that states that the person was killed in a gas leak explosion. The creature's finger then slides under the word after the name and tapped on it, reading the word out loud in the language it spoke. Lucas then takes the dictionary he found and searches through it, finding the word that lined up with it. The word translates to be burned. Lucas looks back to the article. It details that the gas leak caused this person to be burned alive. A quiet pause as Lucas feels his heart begin to race. He asks if what's written after the person's name dictates how they died. The creature nods. Lucas takes one deep breath before asking if this book can kill people. Before the creature replies, the intercom system in the library suddenly kicks in, informing the patrons that the library will be closing in 15 minutes. The shock of hearing the voice causes Lucas to fall over into the bookshelf behind him, knocking some of the books onto the floor. When Lucas looks up, the masked creature is gone. Lucas begins to pick the books up off the floor, and puts them back on the shelves. He collects his thing in the translation dictionary and makes his way out of the library. Okay, I'm going to stop making up the story from here. I have literally spent weeks devising a full complex story for this remake / rewrite / transplant of Death Note taking place in the Pacific Northwest, and I kind of secretly already have made a whole kind of story for this, but this particular video of Story Surgery would be feature length if I did the entire thing. My point that I want to do with this episode is talk about how you can have so much more elaborate story ideas that actually take place in the location in which this reimagining actually falls into. There's a rich history that exists in the Northwest that already is there, and to not use it is weird, if not borderline just rude. Why not use the history that exists at the location you've re-established this story? It would blossom and take hold and plays into the hands of how the original story was a character study, but getting a different twist on how exactly something like Death Note could take place in Seattle. Instead of Shinigami literally being translated into Death God or God of Death, Lucas refers to this mask-wearing person as a Reaper, making the comparison that they're like a Grim Reaper. Not necessarily being too fond of that label, Lucas then refers to this particular masked character as Cedar, based on all of the Cedar apparel that it wore. While not overly enthusiastic about it, they seem to be fine with that. Imagine Cedar being a character that only spoke in a language that your protagonist couldn't understand. Instead, they had to figure out what they were saying on the fly. It's terrifying and thrilling because at any point in time, this thing could be telling you to kill somebody, or it could be warning you that somebody is trying to kill you at a moment's notice. This language barrier adds a level of intensity that adds a more thrilling aspect to the story. Not only does it allow this language to be cultivated and brought forward into a new medium that most people would never know still existed, but keeps it alive. Is this thing telling you to kill people who are following you on the street, or is it telling you to run away? With Cedar in this Death Note Downpour story, you have that level of intensity. As time goes on, Lucas would pick up more and more of the language, and more words that Cedar was saying he was able to understand without the need of a dictionary. Imagine the subtitles at the bottom of the screen had blank spaces because Lucas were only able to pick out some words but not all of them. It's a neat creative way of showing that somebody is picking up on the language that's being said while still not entirely getting the whole picture. These tweaks to the story allow you to have very similar narrative to the original ideas that are found in Death Note, but have key differences that set it apart from how it is a character study. In the original Death Note, the big plot elements was that there was another Death Note in Japan that somebody was using to become a second vigilante. So why not take that idea and incorporate it into Death Note Downpour? Unlike the original story, Lucas does not use the Death Note like Light Yagami does. Lucas is a student enrolled in law school. He's got his priorities, as well as trying to establish that what he's trying to learn into becoming a lawyer or an attorney. Even though that time passes, you could even have Cedar and Lucas have conversations of why Cedar is just following Lucas around, which brings up the idea that Cedar tells Lucas that only the people who touch the book can see Cedar, which means that Cedar following Lucas around means that he could follow him anywhere, but no one's going to notice. Lucas says that he wants to hold on to the book because he doesn't want it falling into the wrong hands, but Cedar says that would be difficult to do because there are 2 books here. That could be a main plot line from the story as a whole, being that Lucas finds out that there's another Death Note in Seattle, which makes matters worse because it's very likely that someone else in the justice system has it. Lucas begins noticing that a lot of the criminals coming out of the Seattle court system are almost always being put to death, or even if they're released, they're being found dead of mysterious circumstances. This means that either someone has been monitoring the criminals coming through and out of Seattle's courts, or someone on the inside is causing all these deaths that are going unnoticed for who knows how long. By having this plot element work in the way that it does, you have almost a mirroring of the original story. Originally, you had Light versus L as a cat and mouse type scenario, a vigilante determining to eradicate all evil from the world versus the brilliant detective who believes that justice is by a certain rule set. In Death Note Downpour, you have somebody who is aware that Death Notes exist, even having one in his possession, attempting to find out who in the city has been using a Death Note to enforce justice by their own means. You have a character study that exists just as prominently as the original. The only difference is that instead of being a power-hungry individual who believes that they can become the god of justice, you have somebody who believes that justice is bound by certain rules, attempting to find somebody who's using their own method of enforcing justice via Death Note. And this doesn't necessarily rule out the idea that Lucas will never use the Death Note that he has. In fact, that's maybe a plot element that is brought into play at one point in time, or all throughout the series. If Lucas finds the person who's been using this other Death Note in the city, will Lucas write their name down in the book that he has? He might be stopping the person who's taking law into their own hands, but he might just turn into the very thing he's trying to eliminate. If you had a book that allowed you to kill anybody just by knowing their face and their name, would you use it? It's the biggest element from Death Note across all of its stories, all of its adaptations and iterations. With Death Note Downpour and the ideas that we've created here, you still keep the root of that idea in play, but you just twist it just a little, so that a new version can be brought forward. You have an adaptation that also manages to bring new ideas that the audience isn't experiencing in the original story, that they would have seen time and time again if this was just retelling the original. It's a slight twist that adds a new layer of story to the original that we've come to know and love. Like a good adaptation, you have something that pays homage to the original story while creating a new set of characters and scenes that still work and exist under the same roof as the original. Sure, you can look at what I've created here as a work of fan fiction, but hey, some fan fiction can make its way into the hearts of many fans of the original series. You want some pretty stellar proof as of 2016? How about this? Andy Weir, the author of The Martian, read Ernest Cline's book Ready Player One, liked it so much that Weir wrote a backstory on one of the main characters. Turns out Cline liked it so much that he made Weir's fanfiction canon to his story. Now, of course, I'm not saying that Death Note Downpour is a perfect story or should be immediately inducted into the Death Note Hall of Fame, and I would never claim that any of my ideas are perfect. I just wanted to explain one important thing about making an adaptation and taking inspiration from other mediums. If you're going to make a story based off of another idea or story, and you want to tell a different time or location with a twist on that story, remember this. Romeo and Juliet didn't take place in Manhattan. West Side Story did. Hamlet didn't take place in Africa. The Lion King did. The Tempest didn't take place on an alien world. Forbidden Planet did. Similar stories, different locations, different times, and they all still worked. And always remember this. If you're going to throw something in a different location, research that location. You'd be surprised how many times you'd find out that there are things that line up pretty well with the story that you're going to tell. And by bringing them into your story, you're not only allowing tradition and folklore of that region to exist, but you're also paying homage to maybe something that nobody would have thought of looking into if you just remade the original idea.
I am justice.
Oh god, okay, wow. That was a long episode, and I've honestly considered cutting this down into smaller parts for easier viewing, but I feel like that is just a cheap way of making more videos for the sake of making more. These videos aren't about the visual input of a video, it's more about listening in and getting understanding about storytelling. That being said, I want to thank you all very much for getting to this part of the video. I've been working on this script for almost 2 months now, and the main reason why it took that long was not only because I had to stop myself from actually writing the entire story of Death Note Downpour that I had, which I technically already have, but I'm not talking about the whole thing here. But the other reason why it took so long is because I wanted to make sure that I did as much research as I possibly could into this region that I'm a part of. I particularly am actually a member of the Quinault Native American tribe that's actually found up here in Washington State. It's on my mother's side that it actually exists in. So for me to want to take this history and this culture that I am somewhat a part of in some ways, shape, or form, and in some ways kind of blend it together into creating an original story that is based off of an original idea from another person's source is a really cool way of writing a story and seeing what you can interpolate from it, and how can you incorporate these ideas from this thing into this other thing, and what kind of story comes out of it from there. Thank you very much for enjoying or watching this particular episode of Story Surgery, and I'll see you for the next operation.